This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm your host, Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest this week is Viktor Rohacs, founder and director of Rohacs Architects. As town planning agents, we know it's as important to secure a successful permission as it is to secure a deliverable permission. Our conversation with Viktor shows that commercial-mindedness is part and parcel, rather than an opposing force, to delivering successful places. Please give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend us to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MPMS Podcast, on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with Viktor Rohacs. Viktor Rohacs, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Today we're actually joined as well by our colleague Taryn Chima, who is joining as our co-host for the episode. Taryn, welcome.
Thank you.
We always like to start off with a little bit about who you are and how you came to your role.
Yes, I'm Viktor Rohacs. I'm the director and founder of Rohacs Architects. As you can hear, I'm not from around here. I'm from Budapest, Hungary, originally, where I trained as an architect. And that's where I spent first 10 years of my career. I moved to London in the very beginning of 2008. The idea was to gain some experience working abroad. But we know what happened later in 2008 and 2009. So
good timing.
Those plans pretty much went straight out the window. And the role I joined was with Hamilton's Architects, which then later rebranded to BFLS. B decided to set up Bogle Architects, and I joined his practice. That was back in 2012. And I resigned from there in 2020 to do my own stuff.
Congratulations.
Yeah. As you can see, timing was never my forte, but it went really well. Rohacs Architects is still a small architecture practice, relatively speaking. We are 4 or 5 of us, but we punch well above our weight. And that's basically because of our combined experience. We got a good understanding of the commercial value of a development, how we present things on paper and when we speak to planners, etc. And also we got this ability to try to think ahead. So what we draw, how is it going to get built? How is it going to be lived in or used? And how is it going to be maintained? Our forte is to try to maximize development value as much as possible. We got a very good track record now of delivering this sort of stuff. Specifically, we target projects which already have got a planning approval, mainly because it's very easy to prove or uplift and value they bring to a project. But the average is about 25-30% uplift when we are allowed to redesign the massing and the volume. If we are not allowed to touch it for certain reasons, then it's about 7 to 12%, which is still a decent amount.
I like how you talked about the ability to look into the future. Like that's what planning means.
Yes.
Literally.
Yes.
And we're also an SME. So very relatable that both relatively young companies, 2019 here, 2020 for you. And having that ability to punch above your weight is a good place to be in the market, I think, especially for an SME, especially for a younger company. And the idea of optimization of a scheme is something that we also face from time to time, where either an architect originally took on the planning or for whatever reason were presented with an existing consent. And you can look at it and be like, oh, why'd they do that and that and that?
We like to put in good, healthy effort and utilize that experience. And yes, a lot of the time it is an uphill battle when we are just sometimes being asked for fee proposals and people are shopping around and they're just trying to get something done at the lowest cost. We're trying to explain them that the little money that someone can save at the early stage of a project might be tempting, but in the long run, they will be facing a lot bigger losses to either risks they haven't foreseen, or just simply, as I said, we come along and we can generate a lot more additional value in the actual end product. And why miss out on that?
How would you compare and contrast the system in Hungary and the system in England and Wales?
Yes, 2 systems are completely different. I think that's no secret.
So more contrast than compare.
Hungary is very much similar to the rest of the continental countries. It's master plan based, the whole planning system. Every single site has got a master plan, essentially, defining and outlining all the basic criteria about density, height, massing, etc. And we as architects, we basically focus on complying with technical requirements, a lot more on the actual appearance of the building and how it internally works. That gives the client a good sort of starting point. So a lot of risks are eliminated in the sense of overall quantum and the initial feasibility discussions, etc. But it also quite severely restricts them in certain cases where they want to go beyond those master plans. Now, that is possible, but they have to then actually instigate a change of that master plan. And it's possible, but it takes 3 to 5 years, which when I left Hungary, it seemed like a long time. But in my current experience here in the UK, it's not that long at all.
Yeah.
And so when you say you have to instigate a change to the master plan, is that 3 to 5 years just to change that small part of it that you want to change in? Or is it a case of them having to revisit the master plan as a whole because of this single change?
Yes, obviously it can be with effect to neighboring sites or sometimes in bigger areas or little parts of town. And those need to be looked at comprehensively. Can't just say, okay, now on this particular site, you're allowed to build a 80-story tower. That's not how it works. So this is why it takes a while to go through the usual studies, prepare all the supporting documentation and everything else. But tedious, long process. And yes, you can imagine most clients not really up for it unless it's a very comprehensive, big regeneration project, for example.
Yeah, which I guess draws that contrast between the preference amongst the private sector to go with the option that has more predictability and stability, takes less risk, and is potentially less reward. But in terms of turnover and volume and delivery capacity, it seems like the default option.
Yes, pretty much.
The discussion in the UK seems to be that site allocations are a middle ground, or air quotes, as close as we get to a zoning system. But I have my doubts about that, not least of all because often the allocations aren't potentially evidence-driven. It's an officer stuck their finger in the air and said 6 to 8 stories, approximate height, but also the indicative massing that they've provided doesn't work in daylight sunlight to the neighboring building. Maybe it doesn't need to have the same amount of attention that a proper master plan would have because they think, well, it's just all going to be sorted out in the 3 to 5 year application and determination process. How do you see that relationship between a master planning option and a site allocation?
I think it's a good comparison, and also it's potentially a good way to try to bring sites forward a bit faster. But my experience is very similar to yours in the sense of I've worked in my previous experience here in the UK on sites which were allocated for development and with clear master plans, indicators for height and density and everything else. In my own experience, it seemed to me that we still had to negotiate from scratch. And that kind of raised for me the question then why the master plan is there, or is the site allocation why it's there. I do have to admit that in the end, I did see that when it actually came to discussions around sunlight daylight, for example, it was a bit more lenient, but it also that we had to put in a lot of evidence and also comparable evidence to make that work. So in the terms of, was there really a tailwind on that sort of front? I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, we're talking about things when there's a major regeneration project and there's 2-story semis right next to it, and the potential impact is going to be greater than the BRE guidance. That's unavoidable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Weighing up everything in balance from scratch just raised for me the question that was this site has been allocated for a very dense and tall development, then why are we going through all these hoops again and again?
Yeah. So I guess maybe one of the contrasts between zoning and an allocation is that an allocation gives you maybe a massing envelope or an indicative sort of starting point in terms of height and use and other ambitions, but it doesn't then also acknowledge that certain things will be acceptable and a given going forward. Everything still needs to be demonstrated and evidenced by the applicant.
Yes.
Are there any particular site allocations or development frameworks where you've experienced these kinds of issues?
Yes, we are working on a site in Edgware where the site has been allocated for development. It's also on a site where there's a grade 2 listed cinema. Our client has owned this cinema for a long time, and it's used to be, as usual, a bingo hall. And they struggled for a long time to try to find a way to bring it back to life now. And there's obviously the site allocation. There's also a massive benefit of bringing back a historical asset into not only a good shape, but also, most importantly, into use. And yes, it is still a lot of things have to be that we go back and start basically prove the appropriateness of something from the beginning. I do have to praise that the local council actually is very proactive and they are working with us on this, and it seems that they are throwing healthy amount of manpower at it to get it over the line. So that's one of my more positive experiences. But allocation or no allocation, even sensible projects sometimes, as I say, take a long time. The project I managed, I just mentioned 28 units. We had 4 pre-application meetings. We had a design review panel. We had 2 major changes post-submission. And you were saying that's quite normal for 500 units, isn't it? But it's 28 units. And it just raises the question for me that, as I said, because communication, everything is very important for us. I'm all up for working with the council and getting to optimize a site together, not just say, my client is telling me this and let's just do this. No, that's not about it. But still, the time involved and the expenses involved in getting to this 28 units, to me, it just seems disproportionate. Yeah. And it seems like a shame when people out there are eagerly waiting to get their hands on and build stuff. Just yesterday, I spoke to a small local window manufacturer, and they said they haven't had a new build inquiry in the last 6 months. All the windows they sold were just for refurb projects. Yeah. And that's telling, and that's very sad. And obviously the impact is on everybody. So we're not in a good place.
I mean, we talk about making planning make sense, trademark, in terms of the multiplier effect that planning reform would have, sort of the benefits that extend far into the economy. And there was a paper recently touting the fact that the built environment sector contributes a larger proportion to the UK GDP than finance, the darling industry of the UK. But your example is also a reminder, I suppose, that the negative impacts of the ineffectiveness or the inefficiencies of the built environment sector have equally negative effects.
Because it's common in the knowledge that, it's developers and it's builders who are struggling. But let's be quite frank and quite selfishly, I'd like to mention, no, it's also consultants, architects like ourselves, engineers, surveyors, yourselves, everyone else. When a project gets delayed that long, how am I supposed to price a project in the beginning? If I tell the client this is going to be God knows how many pre-apps, each pre-app costs this much, never going to get the job. And inevitably, we come to a sensible conclusion saying, okay, so this is what we think is appropriate, but then it usually goes over. And then comes the point when we can't bear the costs anymore, then we have to go back. And it's every single time like pulling someone's teeth. And even the sensible clients, inevitably, they start to lose their nerve and the whole relationship starts to get sour a bit. And it's just not good for anyone. Yeah. And it doesn't matter that in the end we deliver a brilliant result. It's just literally just enough to bring the mood back into sort of normal level instead of people actually being happy about it. Yeah, we achieved something together. Great. No, we don't hate each other anymore because we in the end we got that thing, and it's not a good environment to be in.
No, it's not. I think people are more satisfied when they're more productive.
Of course. We're still lucky because of these good results, but it could be a lot different. It could be a lot more happier environment to work in, as you said.
You know, we've talked before on the podcast about this perception that maybe there's an economic benefit to the system being so inefficient because it keeps us all busy. But I think that you're making this really fair point that
it's not in a good way.
Well, it's not in a good way, and it's not in a productive way. If the development team has to do something 3 times over, even though it really wasn't necessary to do it more than once ever, and getting lower margins and losing their productive time that could be on something else.
Yes, and that ultimately feeds into the system that, in my experience, again, results in some fairly poor projects that being approved.
Develop that a bit. How does that result in poor projects?
A lot of the things that we do is clients come to us with a site. They say they've got an approval for it. Shall we buy it? Shall we not? Can you guys turn this around, etc.? And without blaming anyone, because I'm fully aware of the pressures from all angles in the system, both for consultants, councils, and everyone else. If I just touch on one thing about the councils themselves, they are being flooded with this additional information that they need to assess, which they require these days. I'm not saying any of those are unnecessary. I'm saying there should be a sensible sort of line somewhere where they say, yes, there are very important considerations, policies, etc. It's very important to have sustainable transport. It's very important to have ecology, urban greening, etc. But when the end result is that after passing all these hoops, the scheme emerges, approved, and it's just basically flawed in the sense of internal layouts, it's a death trap. The entire developer's profit is eaten up in the inefficiency of the layouts. And no wonder then a lot of clients say, I'm not buying it, I'm not building that out because that's just not going to work. So when I'm quoted those numbers, of improving schemes, you can see very quickly how something that's got just a very marginal profit on paper, how actually sometimes what we bring to the table and try to improve a scheme, it's not actually an improvement, it's just barely getting it over the line. But if nothing else, some of their profit margins are driven by bank loans, etc. So it's not just that they stick a finger in the air and they say, this is how much money I want to make. A lot of it is actually system driven, isn't it? And if the numbers are not there, doesn't matter how long it took or how much money it took to get that approval in place, it's worthless.
It's something to maybe go off the back of what you were saying with how schemes just end up where they end up because you have to take in all this input from different policies and stuff. In theory, yes, we do have a lot of influence at an early stage, but because you're getting all these different policies in and you're having to satisfy loads of different things at once, you just end up with a scheme and there's very little opportunity to direct development. And then even if that scheme's inefficient, like you say, then the actual fixing of that then comes after planning. So yeah, the influence that we have is like quite minimal to achieve that kind of thing.
And we're advising on each of those things, but it's to the extent that it's not really a question of which consideration you start with on day one. It's that once you tap all those cards into a deck, it's going to look like the product that it basically is going to look like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't know if you've had any similar experience with that, Victor.
When I started to work here in the UK, my memory of the first few projects was that they were submitted for planning in a fairly detailed stage. At least it's a coordinated design. We certainly had structure engineer input. We certainly had a basic M&E input and fire safety, etc. in place when the scheme went in for planning. It seems like after what happened in 08 and 09, this started to phase out. And where we stand right now is that with the exception of the fire engineering that's now recently been brought in, that it's a must, we still end up submitting schemes which don't have any meaningful structural input, even on bigger schemes, and not even proper M&E input except the energy statements, etc. I certainly agree that smaller schemes, say up to 10 units, built in a traditional way, yes, probably you can make that work in the sense, at least at the planning stage. Later, someone will have to look at these bits before it gets built. But on bigger schemes, 50 unit, 100 unit, etc., or schemes where we're saying, okay, we're putting an extra 2, 3 floors on a tall building of 13, 14, 15 stories, it just naturally, it seems to me that it would be really good to have a bit more information, because once then coordinated design starts, that's when people have the bad news about, oh, there's extra structure here, extra risers, extra this and that. And then certainly it's just very quickly is going to start to eat into the areas, and then the unit's going to change and everything else. So that approved planning layout is going to go through a significant change, which it doesn't have to, if at least it's considered to at least a basic level from the get-go.
It's a catch-22 as well, because planning is already so expensive and the risks are already so high that if you could work on a scheme for 5-6 years and then you're still flipping a coin when you get to committee, I imagine that...
I certainly sympathize with that notion, and I understand why.
It just doesn't line up for really anybody's satisfaction the way that it currently works, but I can understand why the detailed design does not come as part of a planning submission, because that's much more expensive. And also, frankly, it isn't planning. I think planning is about use and relationship of uses in land. And of course, there's an aesthetic element, but that's just not a planning thing. Because you're the first person on the podcast to say we actually need to add something to the application.
I'm saying we need to think about it holistically and strike a balance.
Yeah.
What is needed for what?
Yeah.
Rather than this blanket approach that 9 units, landscape proposals, biodiversity, everything, the whole shebang put just and thrown into it. And then when you're looking at a 500 unit scheme, it's exactly the same requirements. It just doesn't feel right, and the resources are not spent well. And yeah, I fully agree that when someone facing such a huge risk about planning, then obviously there's a risk involved and they want to minimize their financial exposure. So that's very simple to see where is it all coming from. But then when I'm being presented with a scheme from a client who wants to buy a site with 70 units in a 9-story building, and my advice is to them is don't buy it, don't go anywhere near, because it's not only the recent regulations, it's even according to the older regulations, it's very difficult to make it work.
Yeah.
I think that's wrong.
Word. No, actually, I think we're completely aligned on what isn't working. I guess my suggestion would be that if planning could be straightforward and not be so type A about certain things, you could get to a planning permission relatively quickly and then go through that opportunity.
Do the rest of the design.
Yeah, I'm drawing this contrast in my mind of an example from Islington, where one of the consultees within the council was concerned about the arrangements of the kitchen because the sink and the draining board should be flipped because it's easier to cook, wash, and then dry. And it's, are you ever going to go into that unit and check? And also,
does that decision need to be made now?
So we're worried about, it's not just ecology, right?
No, the bike stores are annotated with all the dimensions and everything else. I understand that there were previous applications where people just put in space that was insufficient for a bike store. But again, as in the grand scheme of things, would you rather have a bike store that's slightly undersized in an approved application, but the actual typical floor layout work in a general way and wouldn't need a major redesign? Or the other way around, which is right now, is that I submitted a design, all the bicycle stands are annotated, the height and everything, and then no one is looking at that. Victor, has the corridor length been exceeded, the building regulation guidance? In our design, we look after these things. But as I said, when I'm presented with some of the schemes I see approved, some of the basic things are all right, and then those will affect the overall flat layouts, the overall number of units and everything else, and that it becomes a major planning issue. So is detailed design is a planning issue? It's not. But when,
ding, ding, ding.
Or when the planning is achieved, that then we need to go and completely redesign it, it will become.
We will be right back.
Do you think there needs to be some unification of all these different requirements, though? Because you've got planning policy and you've got building regulations and approved documents as well. And some policies reference other documents like building regulations, for example. But do you think there needs to just be more unification of all of these things?
Again, this is probably what we are talking about, small projects or a big project. And as Aaron has just said, putting more things into the hat. Is that the right way? Maybe not. When back in the day in Hungary, we submit something for planning, there is also the same building regulations check as well. So when that planning is approved, it's actually designed to a level that's there's assurance that it works for building regulations. Do we want to marry those two systems? I don't necessarily think so. But then why to put in so much detail into certain things at planning if planning is more about getting, as you said, land use, massing, and generally speaking, on a higher level, what we can get, almost like planning sometimes need to be an outline approval and then subject to, okay, then let's design the internal layouts, including the bike stores.
Yeah.
So they pass building regulations.
I like the idea of a building regs cheeky sense check, because in planning at the moment, we do that in a way already where we're not ready for a fire safety engineer to write this detailed report yet. But we float the drawings over and we say, before we continue from here, can you just have a look? And then they can give basically just like a couple sentences in an email to say, that's not really going to work, or you might need to consider sprinklers, or you might need to add a stair core or whatever. And that's really helpful. What I'm definitely hearing is that we're looking for ways to put the right considerations in the right hats, or at least put the things in the right order.
Yes,
and I think that's a big question and challenge in planning at the moment.
I firmly believe that will result in better schemes being approved, which will stack up a lot better financially. Because if they work, it's going to be then a lot quicker than to deliver them, a lot less risks, because it's a design that's sorted, and they can just basically crack on with the actual detail design and get on build that.
So what you're definitely saying is that the system produces stillborn permissions for the sake of intellectual purity.
A lot of them.
Oh, really? I was just basing you, but you're like, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of people are merrily advertising and marketing sites with these approvals, which
oh my God.
I regularly advise to my clients, stay away.
Marketing brochures are insane. They're insane because there's like an office in an LPA that will literally destroy its own borough before it lets you change the use from an office. And then the sales materials say, oh, this could be like a really nice
airport.
Basically, right? Oh, this could be like an abattoir /C3/C2 subject to planning. And you're like, yeah, That's a big subject.
STP everywhere, yes.
Somebody's got to look into that, by the way. Oh, look, we commissioned an architect to do a feasibility study where they like drew some co-living units into the floor plan. And you're like, there's never going to be a co-living space under the current development plan.
I had a recent experience in that someone asked us to have a look at some of the feasibility options. And we basically drew out why it doesn't work and sent it to the agent and said, look, it just doesn't work. And they said, can we use your drawings in the marketing brochure? I said, no, because we just told you it doesn't work.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And we've had to advise clients who've come to us saying, what do you think about this? Here's the brochure. Yeah, I think I want to do co-living on it or an apart hotel. And then
the calling magic word.
Yeah. The only thing that's viable to build right now in London. And even then,
I'm actually a great believer in co-living and I'm a great supporter, mainly because of my experience when we moved with my wife to London. We went to a house share for a little while and whilst we were searching for an apartment to rent.
Yeah.
And that was a horrific experience. Those places were absolutely horrible. There was 2 places where we lived and maybe we were very unlucky, but I don't think so because I hear the same thing from others. So I would have loved to have a alternative that's managed, that's looked after in a lot better way and maybe smaller, but furnished in a clever way. And there's events in place. There's a breakout space, which I can rent out and just watch telly by myself if I want. And also most important, no, I like it sometimes.
No, that's fair.
But
it's important to be able to.
Yeah, the reason I like to say it's a magic word because a lot of people do miss the point. We did get approval for one of the first co-living projects in London under the new London plan, the previous new one. And we did a lot of research on that. And we came to understand how the roots of it originated from the Silicon Valley as these entrepreneurs were sharing houses and exchanging ideas. And there was a natural sort of theme evolving there. And how it just migrated into big cities. And one of my favorite example is that someone built a co-living project in Paris for single women with children and having childcare facilities in the building and support generally, or whether it's because of divorce, whether it's because of any other reason. But essentially for them to be able to then drop their child off, go to work, get help from the other moms and just generally socialize. And it's a great concept. And I think this is what a lot of people, when they say, oh, you just do co-living, this is what they miss out on. And this is why also the values not as good as they could be because, and I try to explain to developers about this, that if you come up with a plan that people will queue to get into your co-living project, then those values you're running and those numbers are just you're going to way surpass those because you're going to be able to basically charge as much as you like because people want just to get in.
Yeah. At the same time, at the moment, it is one of the viable sort of uses that is still being pursued by developers who actually want to get spades in the ground in just a few years.
Yes.
And typical C3 residential is not. It is more profitable as well for a developer to provide co-living. I do wonder how much of a sort of a market cap there is on it. I have no clue about whether we're close to it or we passed it already and now there's going to be a glut or whatever. But the oceans and oceans of existing C3 residential properties that are shared by 3 or 4 professionals are probably still going to be a main part of the housing uses in London.
Yes.
Because it's still much less expensive to do that than to have your own co-living bit.
Yeah, I fully sign up to that. But as I said, in my own experience, I would have loved to pay a little bit more to be in something that's a lot more looked after. My experience was that those places where we were not very good at all. And I hear a lot of people in the same shoes. In the contrary, a lot of other people say their landlords are brilliant and their houses are looked after and everything else. And if you're lucky, found a place like that, stay. But if you're not, in Croydon, we worked on a scheme recently where the council was asking for evidence for whether there's demand for co-living, and quite rightfully so, because they had a lot of schemes emerging. And that's where our client went away and they said that they've already operated a product and they said these are the demands. We've done all the demographic analysis and everything else, and we believe it actually would manage to be oversubscribed. And that's a good way, for example, to say, okay, do we need more? Because I fully agree that market can be saturated with this particular thing, and then inevitably some of these will start to become less desirable. Let's put it this way.
Which is part of the natural housing cycle as well, in a way. I'm not really challenging the value of co-living as one of the products that we need. I think it does make a lot of sense. I'm thinking about it from my experience of being in house shares and flat shares until I was able to afford my own one-bed shared ownership unit. And that space that a co-living unit would occupy in that continuum of my sort of housing journey in London would be right before my current one and right after my previous one. But it's a narrow swing to go from a happy house share to co-living to a shared ownership one bed. But I always lived with friends who I enjoyed living with.
Absolutely.
That sounds like one of the things. And also, to be fair, if we're talking about the diversity of housing options for people, some people just will not want to live with people, period.
One question on the different housing models we have in England, because obviously our minimum space standard for a one bed is 50 square meters. Is that different in Hungary, that you have more of an allowance for smaller units and that then facilitates affordability? Or is there any contrast to Hungary?
Funny enough, it seems like the unit sizes that we designed back in the day was pretty much exactly spot on what the space standards are all about. The one bed flat I bought as a first flat was a spot on 50 square meter to two-person one bed flat. So
Samesies.
yeah, and that was back in Budapest. So it seems like these numbers, a lot of people say that they are oversized, and I can certainly see in certain sites that we could make it work a lot better. But we do not want to cram people into too small spaces either, because quite frankly, the two-bed flat we used to rent was not even 50 square meters, and it was a two-bed flat, and the rooms were tiny. Very quickly we outgrew it as soon as we had a family and stuff.
As soon as I bought a new winter coat, and then it was
as soon as I had more than 2 pairs of shoes.
It does feel ironic sometimes in London that the idea of a space standard is that you've got enough space to live, but if it pushes it to a point where, because there's a rate per square meter and a lot of people just can't afford to buy that, then the space standard ends up working in the opposite way, because people then cram into house shares instead, where they've got way less square meterage than they would have done if there was some in between, like a smaller studio. I guess that's the theory behind co-living, that you have a smaller space and you pay slightly less for it, and that allows you to have a bit more independence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that the solution to the viability and deliverability crisis isn't necessarily making the standard smaller. I think that there's a lot that we can work on in the meantime, and that does make a more deliverable scheme in the most immediate sense. But I think as practitioners, we also know that there's enough sort of dysfunction and there are enough perverse incentives surrounding that question that making smaller spaces isn't the right place to start. Government and the Mayor of London have released this sort of starting point paper on the changes that they'd like to see made over the next maybe about 6 months, with all of the consultation and the changes to statute, to loosen some of the restrictions on things like SIL, affordable housing for fast track schemes, and then certain specific constraints like the number of units per core per floor, and maybe being quite so precious about dual aspect for ventilation. If we took the changes that they published recently at face value, do you think that these are likely to make a meaningful change in the industry?
Meaningful change I'm a little bit skeptic about, mainly because we're not saying that the schemes are out there and they are underperforming or they are not as good as they could be. We're talking about schemes, they're saying they're just not viable at all. So for me, logically, say when someone says the scheme is not viable to build, let alone carry any affordable contribution, how bringing the affordable contribution level lower is actually going to make a difference to a scheme that already says that it can't deliver anymore. In certain sites, it will work a lot better. It will bring some positive change. But on a grand scheme of things, I'm happy that they're saying they're going to look at the bike store requirements, etc. I cycled to work for over 10 years, and I was never really relaxed to leave my bike in a cycle store, even at an office, etc. So I see no wonder why most of those bike stores are heavily underutilized. But when we start to stack up all these small changes, they're sure are going to bring some positive. Number of units per core, how many cores we need to do, because now we have to do at least 2 cores in most buildings. So is it something that's the subject of a real discussion anymore? Not really. When we are delivering in scale and volume, we will be at least 8 stories or more, then we will have to have at least 2 cores. So when someone says we can go and get more units than 8 units per core, we will have at least 2 cores anyways. Not to mention, when we have 8 cores per a single core, it's very difficult to make those communal escape distances on the corridors to make work according to building regulations. Is it possible to deliver a, say, 12, 13, 14 unit scheme with a single core? Let's say it's low-rise 4-story building. I think it's need to be some serious magic in that to make it work, actually, in the terms of fire safety. Yeah. And
it would be quite an interesting footprint.
Yeah. But it is certain that when we are talking about residential typologies, getting as many units onto as few cores as possible is driving up efficiency. That is absolutely certain. Having the middle corridor typology and units left and right, again, that's the most efficient way of doing things at scale, because that enables to have as little number of cores as possible. And that's inevitably going to mean a lot of the units which are along that corridor are going to be single aspect.
Yeah.
So that sort of restriction and easement on the discussions around and expectations around that will probably help as well. I also say for smaller units, it's certainly not something that's hugely essential. As long as the orientation of those units is not due north and that's it, then they will probably get decent daylight as long as they're designed in a way that they're not too deep. Of course, having a dual aspect, having cross ventilation, and just generally speaking, having the sun go around the flat, that's obviously a nice thing to have, and it's a really good thing. I'm also a very strong advocate of having as much daylight as possible, mainly because I'm very sensitive to this. I can't really work when there's not enough daylight. So if that daylight is coming from a single aspect, but it's still a good quality daylight, I think that works quite well. We don't necessarily need to have it from both the south and both the west as well, or whichever orientation it is coming from.
If we look at these announcements as a forebearer for potential changes to the next London plan, what kind of changes would you add?
That's a good question.
What else do you want to say?
Again, we've got to be careful here because, as we discussed, don't want to throw more things into the hat. But we touched on the subject of
it's a whole new London plan.
Schemes being a bit more deliverable, etc.
Blank slate. Let's go. I'm thinking of where policy is prescriptive, but not necessarily addressing what the objective of the policy is meant to address. For example, for me, like the whole vacant marketing period tool in policies resisting changes of use seem dispassionate about the cost that has on the neighborhood.
How many of those is years and years they're unused and they're hoarded up? It's amazing.
I live in a development that has ground floor commercial space, and I've lived there for 2 years, and most of those units are still empty. And there was a change of use application submitted to change 2 of those units into a gym. It's not been determined yet. That was a while ago.
Yes.
So
yeah, we are trying to then make it more difficult. I think probably 2 safe subjects on this matter. Trying to put some things into the habit of conditioning again, where it will reduce the manpower the council will need to spend on reviewing applications.
Yeah.
And some of them could be quite important, but things that they're not going to majorly affect a application in the later stage. If, say, the bike stores are slightly small and you need to eat into a bit of a more ground floor space, etc., there's not enough greening on the site. You need to submit a landscape proposal post-approval that could be conditioned. And I think some of these matters would then speed up the process and they will get their approval quicker, and then obviously a longer list of conditions. Quite frankly, a lot of those conditions are looked at in detailed design anyway, so that's probably the right place to actually start to deal with those matters.
Yeah.
The other thing I would mention is probably having some of these site allocations is slightly more formative and more definite, in the sense of when we say it's 8 stories, if you choose to do 8 stories, fine, you get a quicker turnaround. If that doesn't work for you, come back with a different proposal and we just then look at it as if it was a planning application for any other site. If you want to go 15 stories, come on, prove us that it works. Why not? But if the 8-story works for you and in exchange you get your planning, let's not be greedy. Let's say within a year.
I'm pretty sure that the statutory limit is 13 weeks.
Then I can certainly see a lot of people would choose to go that route. It's like the fast track on affordable work for a little while for some projects. And then this could be the same way. As there's a site allocation, there's a fast track route. You're complying with the criteria that's a lot defined in density, height, etc.
So basically,
you go your merry way.
Look, the allocation says what we want. If you do what we want, you don't have to prove to us that what we want is okay. Why do you have to do another air quality assessment, another parking survey, another...
Supposedly they've done those things when they said this area is suitable for regeneration.
No, they don't. They do on some things, but the evidence base is not consistent in how much detail they go into for one issue or another. Sometimes it's just, again, maybe only in the level of detail to get it through examination in public, which maybe is a lower bar than it would be otherwise for certain issues, because they just know everything has to be rehashed every time at application stage anyway.
Okay, but then what does the site allocation mean? Unfortunately,
I think that it's not the only consideration that really drives allocation parameters, but it's likely one of the most influential. It's aesthetics, making sure this building's not too much taller than the next one. Honestly, we want to be transformative, but not disruptive. We don't want people to be jarred. And actually, that is how every development on the Isle of Dogs is assessed. If you're standing up next to the observatory in Greenwich, is it going to disrupt the bell curve? You just think that's not real.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm always there.
I have been from time to time.
No, me neither. Just saying that.
One has been to Greenwich. But you think, I was going to enjoy this UNESCO World Heritage Site, but then there's a tall building over in that cluster of towers, and it totally disrupted my experience. We talk about stuff as though it is really important, and it turns out that we're creating rules for ourselves that aren't grounded in reality or lived experience. But anyway.
I think the bell curve is a good example, and it's an important one. A recent scheme I had a look at, the site was 9 stories approved, and it was sandwiched between an older modernist building that was about 15 stories and a cluster of 3 or 4 recent buildings between 25 and 30 stories. And I looked at it and I said, approval was 9 stories. It sits right between these two. According to the bell curve, we should go 20 stories.
Or create a new top of the bell curve, 32.
Or a new top, yeah. That's an absolutely valid point. Instantly we fell on our face. Well, this scheme went through extensive consultations, etc., and there's absolutely no scope to increase the height. Why not? So the bell curve is a good example that, in theory, it is important because it does make the experience of these areas where there's taller buildings a lot more pleasant, but then it's not applied in a constructive way. Most people see as far as first floor tops. I distinctively remember when I started my training as an architect, and that was the day when I was just standing and I realized I'm not looking up to the first floor, I'm looking a lot higher and observing buildings a lot higher than the first floor up to their top. And I was like, wow. And I was walking through my own city and I was like, I didn't know that those things existed because I never ever looked.
Yeah, I had a pre-app in Westminster where we had exact same situation where we were looking to extend a building right around Piccadilly Circus, so a really busy part of London. And as part of the pre-app, we went and did a site visit with the council, with our architect, walked around, and we're all obviously craning our necks, looking at the top of the building. And then you just look around and no one else is doing that. Everyone else is living in the real world and they're looking at the ground, trying not to get pickpocketed. And if it were to be extended, there's very few people that would actually notice it, especially in a location like that. But it's definitely one that architects and planners are more conscious of.
I just walked past the meat market coming to your office, guys, and was thinking about the same thing, really. A lot of lump is missing from the urban fabric there, and I was just wondering when someone's going to come along and stick a tower in the middle of it.
Yeah, the City of London agrees with you that it's an underutilized site, but I don't think that they're about to build a tower there.
No, I don't think anytime soon, no.
The only tower that's allowed to loom over Clerkenwell is the Barbican.
Yes.
Yeah.
But every morning I walk up Cow Cross, I look up and I see the Barbican looking over Clerkenwell, and I think unacceptable impact on the character and appearance of the conservation area.
Overbearingness.
Yeah, I've been overborne. I have soft tissue damage in my neck from being jarred so many times by the Barbican on Cow Cross.
I don't see evidence of those facade materials used anywhere else in the context. I don't know how the context analysis translated into those external cladding materials.
Yeah.
Character study F. But I think it plays into a troubling psyche, I think, in the sector at the moment. And I'm thinking particularly in planning, where development is encouraged to apologize for itself.
Oh, yeah.
For its future existence. Setbacks, slate, grey, metal cladding on said setback. I can still see it.
Yes, it's an interesting side of the conversation because we end up falling short of what we believe could have been an opportunity to deliver something a lot better architecture quality. And I'm not saying just because I'm wedded to contemporary design, etc. What we deliver is regularly not contemporary at all. Simply because when we are talking about maximizing massing and volume, those obviously a lot more important aspects. And very often we end up just following the discussion what we had with the case officers, etc., because external appearance, and again, that's not going to be a very popular thing to say, but it comes like secondary because, oh, okay, so let's just tone it down so it doesn't raise too many eyebrows, because what we really need is for make a scheme work for our client, and that's massing. Bulk is going to deliver it. On the recent scheme in Wandsworth, we were steered, and eventually the scheme almost exactly ended up being a copy of something that was recently approved. And it's not because we looked at it and copied it. It's as we went through the pre-apps and design review panel, in the end, I looked at the drawings, stepped back, and I said, hang on a minute, this looks exactly the same as the other scheme around the corner. And yes, as a pre-app day before yesterday, take cues from more traditional examples of the context, etc. And yeah, I do walk away a lot of times slightly frustrated from these experiences.
Yeah.
Not because I want to push a contemporary design, I just believe that with a little bit more work, there could be something a lot better delivered. It doesn't have to be contemporary, just better.
It doesn't have to be the new London vernacular. Quite a favorite phrase of ours.
Yes, most of schemes do end up looking new London vernacular, exactly.
Yeah. Viktor Rohacs of Rohacs Architecture, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.